Good evening, everybody. Wow, very nice. Okay. Welcome to ongoing series that we've had of music appreciation promotion with the India International Center. I'm Shubha Chaudhary from the Archives and Research Center for Ethnomusicology of the American Institute of Indian Studies. It's great pleasure for me. Sorry? I'm trying to stay. Okay, is that better? I want to not disturb it for Naresh. So, okay. Great pleasure for me to. I'm supposed to introduce Naresh Fernandez to the audience. I'm sure all of you know him very well already, but it just gives me an opportunity to acknowledge his role in this wonderful exhibition that you see around you. He's not only been the curator and written all the text that you read on the walls, but it was his giving us the archives, his Foxtrot collection that really started ARC, as we call it, on its jazz journey. And again, it was thanks to him that we received this immense collection of Niranjan Jhaveri of Jazz Yatra fame through the family of Jhaveri. And that made us think about putting together an exhibition, sharing some of the visual material as well as the audio visual material which are on the computer kiosks around you. So I hope you all enjoy the exhibition as much as the talk. I'd also like to remind those who may not know that we have a performance tomorrow, Jazz of the Swing Era by the Rohit Gupta Trio. So thanks. Over to Naresh.
Good evening. Thanks for coming out. It's wonderful to see new faces, people I know from Facebook. There's one, and there's some there. And old friends who I've known over the years and haven't seen for so long that I haven't even recognized some of them. I've got fat and bald in the interim, and they've got a little older and grayer. Thanks so much to the IIC and Soli Sorabji for giving us the opportunity to put up this exhibition. And thanks so much to Shubha Chaudhary and her team for taking the trouble to put all of this material together. This sort of started, Shubha and I were working on another project together. And after I finished this book on jazz in India, I asked her if she would house the material. Since journalists have pretensions to immortality and thinking that the little notes we've gathered could actually be housed in an archive and perhaps be of value to somebody else. And so I gave her, she said she would take it, and I gave her one bazaar bag and a pen drive full of stuff. And so it sat there until a couple of years later when Niranjan Jhaveri, the great Bombay jazz impresario, who did the jazz yatras across the country along with Soli for 30 years, passed away. And his material was available, and I asked Shubha if she would take it, and Shubha decided she would. I don't think she quite had an idea of what was going to happen. And the moment she said this, about 60 or 70 boxes of enormous things began to flood out from various courier companies and land in her office, completely filling the place. This material had been lying in Niranjan Jhaveri since it was a Bombay house, on a loft and in a garage. And in Bombay, things get fungus. So they began to open this stuff, and they all fell sick. So then they had to go through it with gloves and with surgical masks. So Shubha, thank you for your devotion to music in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health. My presentation is titled How Jazz Became an Indian Music. Some of you here may know some of the characters I'm talking about, and we can talk about them later. One evening, on the evening of September the 12th, which was a Sunday in 1978, a group of enthusiastic fans filed into the Rang Bhavan Amphitheatre in Bombay's Dobhi Talao neighborhood for the inauguration of a music event of the sort the city had never witnessed before. In the tiny classified ads that had appeared in the Times of India in the previous fortnight, the organizers had promised 7 days of mind-blowing music by the greatest musicians in the world. Geeta Mehta, the writer from New York, was at Rang Bhavan looking for material for a book that she would later call Karma Kola, and she seemed rather amused by everything she witnessed. The auditorium was ringed on three sides by the grey stone neo-Gothic buildings of educational institutions such as St. Xavier's College, which had been constructed at a time, she would later write, when dreaming spires and higher learning were more or less synonymous in the British mind. India, on the other hand, was represented by the flora and the fauna. Large banyan trees broke through the cultural pretensions, leaves obscured by tattered kites, roots overrun by Bombay rats scurrying in and out of the event, she wrote. But despite the rodents and the odorous women's toilets, which she also took pains to note, the ambition of the event was unmistakable. It was called the Jazz Yatra, the journey of jazz, and an unmistakable indication of the path it intended to take was to be found on the cover of the rather smudgy program that you can see here. A tagline described the festival as a festival of Indo-Afro-American music. Over the next 3 decades, the festival would, at 2-year intervals, bring some of the biggest names in the jazz world to India. The legends would include Max Roach, who had in the 1950s revolutionized the way the drum kit was played, transforming the drummer from a mere timekeeper into an instrumentalist as vital and creative as any other in the ensemble. There would be the saxophonist Stan Getz, whose wispy tone was instantly recognizable, especially when he played his most famous hit, The Girl from Ipanema, which was the result of an innovative collaboration with some of Brazil's best musicians in the 1960s. Violinist Stefan Grappelli would put a smile on everybody's face with his warm, infectious tone, recalling the time he and the gypsy guitar player Django Reinhardt had given jazz a deliciously French twist at the Hot Club of France in the 1930s. A taste of the pleasures to come over the next 30 years was available at that very first edition of the festival. On the bill was Clark Terry, whose liquid golden tone would influence 2 generations of horn players, and Sonny Rollins, whose free-swinging, unaccompanied improvisations had forced musicians to rethink the very structures of jazz. But inviting big name musicians to India was only one part of what the organizers intended to do. They were just as serious in their mission to demonstrate that jazz was actually an Afro-American music, a form whose development had been profoundly shaped by the sounds of the subcontinent. Of course, if you read any standard jazz history, you'll realize that nobody actually has any real quarrel with that idea. All the books will tell you that starting from the late 1950s, India left a deep impression on several important American jazz musicians. Some of these musicians would, in a general way, attempt to infuse jazz with the intensity of Indian spirituality. Others would incorporate into their performances the specific techniques of improvisation that they had adapted from Indian classical music. Most prominent of them was the meditative saxophone player John Coltrane, whose study of rag-based music under the guidance of Ravi Shankar in the 1960s had opened up new directions for jazz. In an acknowledgement of his debt to the subcontinent, Coltrane would compose a song called India, record an album titled Om, and name one of his sons Ravi. Of course, Ravi Shankar and his role as India's most prominent musical proselytizer in the West also finds mention in most jazz histories. They'll tell you how his performances across the US and Europe and his seminal international recording from 1957, The Sounds of India, released on Columbia Records, brought new ideas to performers across a range of genres. Western classical musicians like Philip Glass, pop musicians like George Harrison of the Beatles, as well as jazz performers. But like so many other narratives in circulation, these accounts foreground the experiments and strategies that had gained currency in the West, and accords credit for them to Western musicians. That's an impression the organizers of the Jazz Yatra were hoping to correct. Over the 30 years that the festival lasted, the organizers, notably the passionate Mumbai impresario Niranjan Jhaveri, whose collection forms the core of the exhibition we can see on these walls around us, would attempt to remind the world of the very deep roots that jazz had sunk in India, and to bring to attention some of the fruit and flowers that the tree of Indian jazz had produced. And so, to indicate the general terrain they hoped the Jazz Yatra would explore, the honor of giving the first performance at that first performance of the festival was accorded to an aging Parsi man with the slightly glossy sheen of brill cream in his hair. He shuffled onto stage that slightly chilly evening in 1978, presumably having dodged the rats, to blow out these notes from his saxophone. Okay, so that wasn't by any stretch of the imagination a virtuoso performance by Rudy Cotton. But to people who had been following his career, like Soli Sorabji, and the history of the development of jazz in India, that rendition of Rag Soni sent shivers up their spines. Rudy Cotton had been playing jazz in an Indian way long before John Coltrane met Ravi Shankar. In fact, Rudy Cotton had been playing jazz for longer than any of the American legends who was present at that first edition of the Yatra. That isn't really surprising. Jazz, after all, was the world's first pop. As most of you know, jazz was born in the melting pot city of New Orleans in the American South, when bluesy, African-influenced field songs and the polyrhythmic drumming of slaves in the cotton fields in the American South mashed up with the sophisticated harmonies of European classical music. All of this was rounded out by what we now call the Spanish tinge, the Latin melodies and rhythms of the Iberian colonies of South America and the Caribbean. Jazz was a great sponge, predicated on an open-mindedness that allowed it to absorb into itself any sound that was interesting or pleasurable. A happy technological development ensured that jazz made its way to the furthest corners of the planet rather quickly. Jazz was born at the same time as cheap gramophones became available throughout the world, and the new music from America traveled across the oceans in the cargo holds and passenger ships and the cargo holds of steamships. The first mention I could find of jazz in the Times of India was in April 1919. And to be honest, the starchy paper of record was not impressed. After all, this was an era before they began to organize literary festivals with dodgy guests. Here's what the paper had to say. London appears to have been taken by jazz bands and jazz dances, and the clergy are denouncing the dance as indecent, immoral, and degenerate. The Times had based its piece on an interview with a chap called Ross Sobel, who was the bandmaster of the Maharaja of Cooch Behar, and he had just returned from London. He confessed to the Times that he found the jazz craze inexplicable. But from its very infancy, Indians had pretty strong ideas about how to improve this music. Working in the New York Public Library a little while ago, I came across a record of a lecture given in Buffalo, New York in 1922 by a man called Harendranath Maitra, who was described as one of India's leading scholars, musicians, and journalists. After his lecture, he was asked for his opinion of American music. American jazz music, Maitra sneered, that is not music. It lacks rhythm and expression. And he predicted, I don't think it'll last long. But he had a solution. America should blend some of the finer Hindu tones to enrich the music. Jazz, he said, had one redeeming quality. It is lively. Indian music, of course, is far superior. Indian music moves in soft flowing rhythm. More and more you get into its swing, you will feel poise, balance, and harmony you never felt before. His final recommendation, American composers should strive to create a similar atmosphere around their compositions. Of course, the impulse to snatch and grab the best bits from diverse, seemingly unlikely traditions has long characterized Indian performance. In the middle of the 19th century, for instance, the dominant form of organized entertainment in urban India was a vibrant genre of Hindustani Urdu drama known as Parsi theatre. The companies looked something like this. It got its name because of the fact that the large touring companies that took it around the subcontinent were owned by Parsis, even though the performers were drawn from a range of religious and ethnic groups and even nationalities. These troupes would do anything it took to put on a good show. As the scholar Catherine Hansen notes, Parsi theatre crafted the first pan-Indian theatrical form by blending certain European practices of stagecraft and commercial organization with Indic, Persian, and English stories, poetry, and music. Among the people who best exemplified this adventurous spirit was this man, Kavasji Palanji Khattar, who came to prominence as an actor in the Empress Victoria Theatrical Company in the early years of the 20th century. He gained great prominence for his role as Hamlet and his strong singing voice, and graduated to writing operas himself. He's credited with having turned Ali Baba and his 40 Thieves into an Urdu opera. He evidently passed on his flair for performance to at least one of his grandchildren, a boy who would also inherit his name. But Kavasji Khattar didn't seem slick enough for someone who wanted to make his living as a jazz musician, which is why he decided to change his name to Rudy Cotton. We know that Rudy was interested in jazz from at least 1935, when the elite residents of his home city of Bombay were driven into a tizzy by the goings-on at the Taj Mahal Hotel, the epicenter of social life of the city's affluent. That winter, after almost a decade of listening to the sounds of New Orleans on records and being performed by local bands, India was finally going to have its opportunity to listen to its first African-American band. Or to use the very racist phraseology that the Times of India used at the time, its first all-Negro band. It was led by a dapper violinist from Minnesota named Leon Abbey, and they played in a quicksilver tempo that Bombay's dancers found almost impossible to keep up with. But they were a great hit anyway. For young musicians especially, who had learned to play this new music by listening to records and by reading scores, this was a chance to learn from the masters. One of the musicians in Leon Abbey's band, the horn player Bill Coleman, left a detailed account of his time in India in his memoir, which is titled Trumpet Story. It's filled with little details about what the musicians ate, their accommodations. Evidently the Taj was filled with lizards, and the quirks of the clients at the Taj. He also writes about a young musician named Rudy, who was captivated by the smooth tenor saxophone playing of Coleman's bandmate, Cass McCord. Coleman wrote, he and his buddy used to come to the hotel in the afternoon after we had lunch and asked us questions about jazz music and the musicians they'd heard about. By 1940, Rudy Cotton had put together his own band and was spending a lot of time on the road playing in Delhi and Simla. Summer often found him at Hackman's Hotel in Mussoorie, playing swing-tinged dance music in his unique style. Among the dancers on the floor in Hackman's in 1947 was this young British soldier who would go on to make his living as a jazz drummer when he returned to England. Roy Holiday is now 90. He still plays, And Rudy made such an impression on him, he occasionally sends me Facebook messages about the saxophone player's music. Just last month, Roy wrote to me saying, "Hello Naresh, can you help me please? Just prior to partition, there was some consternation as to whether Western dance music might or might not be acceptable. Rudy Cotton had arranged and transcribed some traditional Indian melodies to be played as rumbas. Do you know if any of these was ever recorded commercially? Many thanks and very kind regards, Roy." As it turns out, this recording of the Jazz Yatra is the only evidence we have of what Rudy actually sounded like. But we know from the accounts of Roy Halladay and from many others at the time that Rudy had been trying to find an Indian way to play jazz in an Indian way for a very long time. He wasn't the only one. Another acquaintance I've made on the internet is a chap who also lives in the UK called Percy Khatau. He is Rudy Cotton's son, and he sent me this photograph of his father and a couple of musician friends on tour in Rangoon in 1939. If we ever needed evidence of how significantly our lives can be shaped by the friends we have when we're young, it's evident in this picture. Each of the men in this picture was passionate about jazz and admired the freedom that it represented. They wanted nothing more than to become skilled enough at the instruments to play with complete abandon, to play like African Americans, they said. Each of these men would change their birth names, and each of them would construct important signposts indicating possible paths that jazz could take on its journey in India. The man on the right was born Franklin Fernandez in Goa in 1920. And like many members of his community, he loved music. He started playing in his church orchestra and developed his talent for playing in the village marching band, things that still exist in Goa that play at weddings and funerals, which I really like. As a teenager, he heard records by American jazz musicians and was greatly struck by this. Jazz, he said, gave him freedom of expression. I interviewed him when he was getting on, and he told me, like Indian music, jazz can't be written. You have to feel it. There are 12 bars, but each musician plays it differently. Morning you play different, evening you play different. You play as you feel. Franklin Fernandez grew so enamored of the new music from America that in 1936, when he was 16, he decided to make his living as a trumpet player. He headed to Bombay, where, like so many other Goans, he hoped to find work in one of the city's famous dance bands. Of course, it wasn't quite so easy. Competition for jobs was intense. So he began to work at the Bata Shoe Company in Mazagon for 12 annas a day. But after work, he performed at amateur nights at Green's Hotel, which was next to the Taj, hoping to attract the attention of somebody who mattered. His big break came in 1941, when he was hired to play at the Taj in the band of Teddy Weatherford, who you can see behind the piano here. Teddy Weatherford was a famous African-American pianist who had spent his life, his childhood, working in the coal mines of Virginia. But he came to India quite early. He'd been playing in India since 1936. And playing alongside Weatherford really helped Fernandez develop an understanding of the more subtle understandings of African-American music. But like Khatau, and this is where I disagree with him, he thought that Fernandez was no name for anybody aiming to be a jazz musician. So he tweaked his name and emerged to the world as Frank Fernand. Pretty soon he found a job in Rudy Cotton's band, and by the mid-1940s he was playing in Missouri every summer. That's where he was in 1946 at Hackman's Hotel, when the Congress Party and the Muslim League reached a deadlock in their negotiations with the cabinet mission about the modalities of Indian independence. As talks ground to a halt in Simla, Mahatma Gandhi headed for Missouri on May the 28th, 1946. At a meeting on May 31st, Gandhi described the problems faced by India's untouchables, and then he moved on to discussing the famine that was sweeping the country. He appealed to the affluent to donate every grain of food they could find. The only solution to India's hunger problem, Gandhi said, was self-help and cooperation among all, and the removal of corruption that resulted in profiteering on the black market. As it turns out, Frank Fernand was in that audience, and the speech completely electrified him. As he put it years later, Gandhi completely changed my ideas. He went back and began to read Discovery of India, and the book prompted the trumpet player to rethink the relationship between art and society. He grew determined to give the jazz he loved a uniquely Indian expression. Now, this took some work because Frank Fernand had been trained in the Western classical tradition in Goa. So he began to seek out Hindustani musicians and realized that their approach to their music helped him in his jazz playing. I was fascinated by the rhythm, he said. It was far in advance of the jazz I was playing. The encounter with Gandhi also transformed Fernand into a bit of an activist. In January 1947, he was at the forefront of an effort to start a trade union called the Federation of Musicians, bracket India. We've always loved these brackets, which aimed, as they said, to organize and unite the persons engaged in the profession of Occidental music throughout India to regulate their relations with their employers. As my friend Roy Holiday from the UK had noted, the 1940s were an uncertain time if you were a jazz musician in India. They weren't certain whether the new India would have a place for them culturally. Frank Fernand laid out some of these anxieties in a newsletter for the Musicians' Federation. What of prohibition, he wrote. Prohibition had been introduced in Bombay province from 1939 when the Congress government was elected. Will the purists proscribe the habit of Western dancing? Will all those elements in India who are not yet part of the Indian Union be regarded as foreigners? And his last question was particularly important for Goan musicians because Goa was still a Portuguese territory and would continue to be until 1961. But despite these fears, Fernand was among the musicians on the stage in the ballroom of the Taj on the midnight of August the 14th, 1947. All of Bombay's smart set was there too. There was the industrialist J.R.D. Tata, the mayor of Bombay, A.P. Sabawala, the irascible journalist Dosu Karaka, and Nehru's sister, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. As midnight struck, the ships in the harbor sounded their sirens, and the crowds that had been milling on the street outside by the Gateway of India rushed into the hotel in their excitement. On stage, the jazz musicians launched into a jaunty version of the national song Jana Gana Mana. The journalist Dosu Karaka later described the scene in one of his books. Happy chaos descended, he recalled. Men in dinner jackets danced with men in dhotis. Gandhi caps were tossed into the air. Outside, the crowds crooned Jai Hind to the tune of It's a Long Way to Tipperary. I can't quite imagine what that sounds like. So freedom came, like all the New Years rolled into one. Just over a year later, Frank Fernand was back at the Taj with many of the city's best-known jazz musicians to mark the formation of the Bombay Swing Club, an organization that wanted to present jazz as a serious music, not just as entertainment. Here's the program from that event. From later reports, we know that Frank Olegario, whoever he was, received huge applause for his baritone rendition of Old Man River. And there was a flurry of request tunes in aid of the benevolent fund of the Federation of Musicians. The highlight of the evening, though, was an original piece by Frank Fernand. It featured, we know from reports, a haunting trumpet solo, and it was called Prabhat, or Dawn. It was described in the program as an Indian theme. Frank Fernand's meeting with Gandhi, it seemed, had finally borne fruit. Like so much other music from that period, though, we have no scores or recordings, and we don't know what it sounded like. But as consolation, we do have recordings of some of the songs he wrote for Amchi Nasheeb, a Konkani film he later produced and wrote the score for. It was only the second Konkani film ever made, and this tune combines the Goan folk songs he so loved with jazz. So let's listen to a section of that.
sreč pashin Kalis konak rata zaidashin Mukota umedin ekoshin.
So that was Amchi Noshir. Let's return to that picture that Percy Qatar sent me. The other man in this picture was born Antonio Xavier Vaz in 1916 in the village of Aldona in Goa. But he later changed his name to Chick Chocolate. As a young man, he fell in love with the music of New Orleans, especially the trumpet playing of Louis Armstrong. He began to style himself on Armstrong, even going so far as to watch his films repeatedly so he could copy Armstrong's mannerisms. In the 1940s and the 1950s, Chick Chocolate was everywhere. He was performing at the Taj, at the National Sports Club in Bombay, and he was taking turns with his friend Rudy Cotton to perform at Hackman's in Missouri. But by the 1950s, Chick Chocolate had developed a parallel life that gained his music a great deal more popularity than his dance music, only the listeners didn't know he was playing it. He, like his friend Frank Fernand, was playing jazz in the nights, but in the mornings and afternoons, he spent them in the Hindi film studios. As it turns out, jazz musicians and other musicians trained in the Western tradition were in great demand by the film industry. That's because of the structural differences between Indian and Western music. I'm going to briefly explain what that means. It's that Indian music is melodic, and the main performer plays a single melodic line which everybody else reiterates. On screen, this sounds really thin if you have only a sitar going or only a flute going. But to effectively convey the drama unfolding on stage, film soundtracks lead large orchestras all playing together to emphasize the urgency of a car chase, to highlight the suspense of an impending murder, or to serenade a sweetly developing romance. They need harmony, with all the musicians of a band or the orchestra playing in related pitches. Now, most of the composers of Hindi scores, who in India we call music directors, they were trained in Hindustani music. People like Naushad and C. Ramchandra, or later Shankar and Jaikishan and many others, they had a great talent for creating memorable melodies, but to be translated into effective screen music, these had to be harmonized, to be played by orchestras. This is where Chick Chocolate and the jazz musicians came in. Now, as I said, many of them had received their musical training in the Western classical tradition, and they were among the few groups in India who knew about harmony. So the composers of the film scores began to hire these musicians as assistants to help them with their scores. Here's how the work would proceed. The producer would organize a sitting, as the Goans called baitaks, at which the composer, who was most often a Hindu, and the lyricist, who was most often an Urdu-speaking Muslim, and his most often Catholic assistant, would flop down on comfortable cushions and listen to the director narrate the plot. When the director indicated the point at which a song was necessary, the composer would hum out a melody or pick it out on his harmonium. And the assistant would note down these fragments, which would later be pieced into a song. And the assistant would go back to the studio and add parts for the banks of violins and cellos, the horn sections, the piano, and the percussion. In the West, the assistant would have been called the arranger. He arranged the parts for the various instruments. But the assistant wasn't merely taking dictation. It was his job to craft the introductions and the bridges between verse and chorus. Drawing on their bicultural heritage and their experiences in the jazz bands, the Goans gave Bollywood music its promiscuous charm, slipping in slivers of Dixieland stomp, Portuguese fados, Ellington-esque doodles, cha-cha-cha, Mozart and Bach themes, whatever caught their fantasy. In addition, the majority of the musicians in most Hindi film orchestras were members of swing bands. That's because while the sitars and the sarods and the flutes and the other Indian instruments that were often the lead instruments in their song, the bulk of the instruments in an orchestra were clarinets and violins and trumpets, instruments that were needed to create harmony. For an orchestra to play effectively, the musicians need to be able to read notation of a score. The musicians who played the Indian instruments weren't able to do this because Indian music can't be notated. And so they had to rehearse their parts repeatedly until they'd learnt them. But the jazz musicians with their Western training were all fluent readers of musical scores, which made the recording process much more efficient. And soon, the orchestras in the film industry and the film studios weren't looking very different from the swing bands that Chick led in the evening. This is a picture of C. Ramchandra's orchestra. He also worked with Madan Mohan. This is Ramchandra with a very young Lata Mangeshkar and Rafi in the background. The music they created was perhaps less ambitious than the experimental music that others at the time were trying to devise, but it captured the imagination and the spirit of post-independence India. I'm going to leave you with one of the best-known examples of that sound, but before I hit the button on it, I'd like to reiterate my central thesis, that jazz has such a long history in this country, it's been absorbed into the soundscape, so that when it now appears as an element in an A.R. Rahman soundtrack, or when it's performed by young musicians like Tarun Balani or Sharik Hassan, it doesn't seem unusual or exotic anymore. And that's because these three men, Rudy Cotton, Frank Vernon, and Chick Chocolate, though they had different approaches, played a vital role in making jazz and Indian music. We may not have had plastic surgery in ancient India like our Pradhan Mantriji claimed. The Heisenberg principle may not have been inspired by the Vedas, but we know one thing for sure, that before John Coltrane brought jazz to India, Indian musicians were trying to make a home for jazz in India. And as evidence of that, here's a song from the film Asha in 1957. Please feel free to clap your hands or dance in the aisles.
Minadika, Damanika, Makanaka, Tika Pikarika, Ina Minarika, Dika, Damanika, Makanaka, Tika Picarolarika, Rampam Coach.
Thanks, you've been a kind audience. Questions? Okay, I'll take a couple of questions if there are any.
Well, you just ended where it should have begun.
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff. For that, sir, read the book again. Though the book has only one chapter on this, you're right.
Can you explain the example of Rahman that you're saying? One example.
I mean, there are no specific things, but just in the techniques he uses, you can hear swing riffs every now and then. It's in the way things are arranged. These guys broke the ground for Western music to be structurally introduced into film music, and it's remained there ever since. Ilaiyaraaja and all of these people follow the examples and some of the experiments that these guys conducted, I think. There's a great deal more about this in a book called Behind the Curtain by a scholar called Greg Booth. So that's got lots of the answers.
Can you tell me something about a CD which I recently found has been brought from an old LP by Shankar Jaikishan? It's called Jazz Indian Style.
It's called Raga Jazz Style. And so Shankar Jaikishan had some excellent, they had an excellent arranger called Sebastian D'Souza who worked for them, and excellent jazz musicians. There was a guitar player called, what was his name? It's escaping me, but the pianist was a woman called Lucila Pacheco. And so they decided to take them outside the context of the film studio and record what at that time these things were called private recordings. And that album did quite well. It's again quite stilted, but it was among the many experiments that were done in India at that time. Actually, there's the Sachal Orchestra from Pakistan, which plays, they are a recreated Lollywood orchestra. They're going to be in Delhi tomorrow, I think. And they play a lot of bossa nova, Girl from Ipanema, that Take 5, Dave Brubeck's Take 5, in sort of great filmy orchestral style. And in a way, they're following an album that was made in India in 1965 called Sitar Goes Latin, which had Besame, Mucho, and all of these things. And some of the musicians who played on that are now so embarrassed by it, they call it Sitar Goes Latrine. It was Goans and Anglo-Indians, mainly, because these were the groups that knew how to play Western music. But the Goans, I think, followed a different trajectory because the Portuguese did nothing in Goa. They created no industry or anything. So Goans have always been great migrants. You know that more than anybody else, Sunit. So music was among the professions that the Goans chose as a way to make a living. And they made their living in marching bands in East Africa. They went across Southeast Asia. Some of them were bandmasters to Maharajas. And they just played the latest style. Whenever something new came along, these guys would teach themselves how to do it. And so when jazz came along, this was the new style that they had to play for the rich people whose parties they were at. And some of them really felt passionately about jazz. They thought that jazz spoke to their experience, which is why jazz became such a big thing among the community, I think.
You know, Bombay has always been the center of the advertising industry. To what extent, for example, radio jingles, which were really big, to what extent were they consumers of this Indo-jazz and patrons of these musicians?
I think in the early years it was mainly the film industry, and I think the jingles came a little later, and the jingles, like the film industry, sort of incorporated anything. So when you listen to some of those early jingles, you'll hear Calypso. I found a fabulous 45 called Britannia Calypso, which was such a catchy tune that they released it on Polydor. So the advertising industry sort of drove them later. And in the later years, Louis Banks, the famous pianist from Calcutta, moved to Bombay, and he played jingles. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming, and please take a look at these fabulous panels that Shubha and her team have put together. Good night.